Hey, I saw this on Mormon Book Reviews today. Kolby Reddish was out there. He did a great job. I really like listening to him. I think he really is trying to find the truth out there, and I hope he finds it. He and I obviously disagree on a few things. I'm going to try to keep his parts of the argument intact, but I have an iPhone which only has like 1 meg of space on it, so I'll do my best to make it short.
If those quotes regarding the rock and the hat narrative, which again are in and addressed to all believers in Christ and Emma
Mhm.
Smith's final testimony, by church leaders deciding which parts of those documents to incorporate into their faithful correlated narrative,
Mhm.
they absolutely had to, like Emma Smith's final testimony is like maybe 2 or 3 pages. It's not very long.
Mhm.
So to pick and choose lines from it that are incorporated into materials that the church has used for generations demonstrates that at least church leaders were
Yeah.
aware.
So I think the implication there is if the leaders knew about it, but the general membership didn't, then the leaders must have been withholding that information, which totally makes sense. That's definitely one way to look at it. For me personally, being a frontline customer service person in 3 different corporations, I know that there's a lot of times that you know about information that drastically affects the customer experience in a negative way, but when you try to pass that on up the chain, it just kind of gets lost in translation. So I know that any organization that's going to be huge, as much as we want to believe the people at the top know everything, they don't. Like you have things like Sarbanes-Oxley that want to treat the people at the top like they should know everything. Honestly, they just don't. And so I think that's where the trouble is for me to like for anybody who's like trained an incoming manager who didn't know anything about your job, or you got passed over for a promotion and the person that took your place, you had to train them how to do their job, then you know the people on top of you don't always know everything. And so I think it's not realistic to expect the people at the top, even if they're in the approval chain, to expect that they know all the little details that are in there that they're approving.
I never believed that prophets were infallible.
Oh, see, there you go. I mean, maybe the people at the top just weren't aware of all the details of what they were approving. They just trusted the people below them to do the job well, especially if they were having positive results. If it ain't broke, why try to fix it? So that might be why these traditions just kept going for years and years. Again, it was going well, so, why dig into it? Just trust the people below you because they mean well. And, that's how organizations behave.
But if we're going to accurately talk about the scope of the problem, so Austin referenced the racial restriction on the priesthood ban, or
Mhm.
the racial restriction on priesthood and temple blessings. To really deal with the evidence and the scope of the scope of that problem when you deal with the Lowry Nelson letters and you read a book like Second Class Saints by Matt Harris that really shows how this process worked slowly and gradually over time, and there were politics involved. What you really have to deal with is not infallibility. Throw infallibility out the window. What you have to deal with is prophets, most of the prophets of the church, teaching something as doctrine that the church today says was not doctrine. And in fact, says in the opening lines of the Race and the Priesthood Gospel Topics essay was so obviously not true because the Book of Mormon preaches that all are alike unto God, black and white, bond and free, male, female. That's the reality of the problem. And so, again, in attempting to bridge build and try and have as much charity for Austin's position as I can, I just I just wish that apologists would deal with the real problem. The problem isn't, oh, critics of the church had this ridiculous expectation that they thought prophets were infallible. We're not talking about fallibility. We're not talking about a guy who may, you know, be harsh with his kids sometime or not pay his income taxes on time. We're dealing with real questions when you actually look at the evidence that goes right to the heart of whether these men are what they've claimed to be for generations. And that's the reality of the problem.
All right, so maybe I'll learn more about Colby's position, but my understanding here is that he's got the assumption that what's true and what's right to be objective have to be static. And that isn't the case, as I've shown in the OG Happiness letter. And so I think that's one of the things that caused him to struggle is that he assumed that what's true and what's right, if it were objective, could never be changed. So later prophets couldn't like undo what previous prophets had done. I think a lot of people struggle with that, and I understand that, but that doesn't have to be the case.
Ultimately, I really only care about believing in Mormonism or any theological claim, frankly, if that belief is true. So when I hear responses from someone that their best evidence for belief, their best reason for belief is a demonstrated logical fallacy, I just feel so, I don't know what to do with that at that point. It's just not going to work for me. And I feel like that's where we can have interesting conversations about the epistemology. I do want to highlight that the fact that Austin supports his belief in the church with a fallacy doesn't mean that that belief is wrong. And this is, again, one of my invitations to apologists to believe that an argument is wrong just because someone supported with a fallacy is actually the fallacy. And so this is where my plea to apologists is make better arguments. Make arguments that actually relate to the underlying truth claims. And when someone points out to you that argument is actually a logical fallacy, you should have some response other than that doesn't matter. Because the reason that, Aristotle and his band of merry logicians developed these logical forms, and we know what we do about logical fallacies, is because they cannot, by definition, lead you to a true conclusion. So we need to stop making those arguments.
Oh, this one here, I think Colby's just going to have to come to grips with at some point. Like, if he's looking for a solution that's purely logical, we already know through Gödel's incompleteness theorem that if something's going to be purely logical, then it's going to be inconsistent. And if it's consistent, it's going to be incomplete. So that you're going to have assumptions from outside or something that can't be proven logically. So until Kolby realizes that there's a reason why we don't just use Aristotelian first order logic, and that there's actually tons of different logics that have developed since that time, he may not realize that, again, the logic is something we use to understand the universe. The universe isn't necessarily bound by logic. We develop our logic based on our observations to see if they're consistent with what we observe.
The thing that I'm more interested in is having a conversation about principles and about the things that we believe. If I believe, like you believe, that I should treat other people kindly, what in the world does it matter that you think that Jesus had some divinity in him? And I think that that's just something that was said by a guy that is worth making part of my life's principles.
Well, that's precisely the reason why we teach Jesus Christ, because if he really is divine, then the principles that he's sharing with us can really help us so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And especially if we have a disagreement with our principles, then we can go back to that objective base, the foundation of Jesus Christ, and resolve our issues by trying to understand what Jesus Christ was really trying to teach us.
One of the first things my wife and I did when we left the church was we generated, I don't want to call it commandments or rules or whatever, but we generated a list of principles by which we're going to guide our family. Because when you leave the church, you're left having to build up things that the church just kind of automatically gives you to lead your family, or that you are more on autopilot for. It feels like even when you correct someone, and I've corrected both of those gentlemen, where they've been absolutely factually incorrect, and yet their conclusion doesn't change, it almost makes me feel like it doesn't matter. And that's where I just wish we would focus more on the principles that we want to live our lives and build our society around, because I honestly think 95% of people probably largely agree on the principles that we share and that we want to build a society around. And man, do I wish we spent more time having those conversations about the commonalities that we have, rather than trying to argue that it's reasonable to believe in magic rocks. I just think sometimes that just gets so ridiculous that I wish we put more effort into the other things.
And there you have it. Again, I'd say the reason why we talk about Jesus Christ is because he forms the foundation of the principles that we're talking about. Because, again, when we come to a disagreement, we're going to have to figure out how to resolve that disagreement. And that objective of Jesus Christ and that foundation of Jesus Christ provides us with some sort of objective. Again, if he's divine, then he provides us an objective basis so that we can resolve or arbitrate those disagreements that we have on the principles that we decide we're going to use to form our society. Anyways, there's Kolby. He did a great job on this interview. I really do think he's genuinely looking for the truth. I hope he finds it. And I'll actually go more in depth in the different things that we talked about during this video in other little shorts. But I thought I'd make this a little bit more long form so that you can see more of his argument. Go watch the full thing so that you get the full idea of what he's talking about. Because the shorts, I'm going to do my best to just try to capture a little bit of his idea in my rebuttal or things that I have to add to what he has to say. But, I want to make sure that I'm presenting it as charitably as possible. Because, again, I think he's genuine about what he's saying and that he's trying to do what he believes is right.